Roger, because of the shortage of what we're going to be able to put out, can we address some of the other issues that you think are quite crucial at this time when we've got the Arctic melting?
Yes.
Therefore, we've got to think quickly, what can we do to offset the effects of that? Or in other words, and what can we do to bring about a balancing of what's happening with the increase in global gases there? And the second thing is, what other issues do you see as like things that if we do not address them, they are going to address us and get rid of us very soon?
Well, one of the things that are very close to my heart, obviously, is bees. And we had a very good field day on Saturday morning, and the aspect here is now reached what I think we've reached a crossroads in terms of our bees and the pollination services for our fruit industry. And it is really a microcosm of what is happening to bees all over the world. So if we look at the diseases, and we just take one disease as a particular problem at this point, is American foul brood, and we look at what this has done and how it has devastated bee colonies all over the world. I was quite interested to read that Aristotle, in his notes, mentioned that he came across hives that were really smelly. And there's now thinking that maybe AFB goes back even as far as to that time. Certainly AFB has been known about since about 1908, I think, if not even before that. And looking at records of the smell, because that's what it's called, foul brood, it stinks. But if we look at this in terms of our food aspect again, and I'm talking about this issue of intensive versus extensive, the farming in terms of pollination has become to the point whereby bees are brought in to do the pollination and the bees are taken out once the pollination happens. And they're taken out because there is simply nothing left for them to eat, to live on. There's no more pollen and there's no more nectar, because the farm is absolutely devoid of any other plant. Only that crop is planted. Many of those crops the bees actually don't like. If they had preference to go to this particular, like for instance, almond tree, or went to another weed that was growing down there, they'd rather go to the weed because it was much nicer for them than the almond. But there is no weed, so they have to go to the almond. And we are looking now here at about a 40% loss of swarms available for pollination. And it's regarded that the number is about 65,000 swarms necessary to do the pollination for our fruit industry here. Now, some of the bees will be moved twice. In other words, they will pollinate the early blossomers, and then they will be moved into the later blossomers. So you might have your pears and plums, I think, at first, and then they might move to the apples or whatever. So the actual numbers are probably around about 50,000, and there's a 40% loss on that. Right now, we're looking at an industry that employs 65,000 people here and brings in billions of forex. And as exchange rate at the moment would go, this would mean a lot of money and a huge loss in South Africa. Now we come back again to this issue of the water aspect about it. Bees require water. They have to have some water. And so if we mistreat our water system, we are going to affect not just the bees, but all insects, a whole range of insects. And if we if we look at the matter of the stress that the bee comes on, there has been a number of studies done, and one of the factors is the stressing of the bees. And now that we have this American foul brood, we are expected to open the hives up and go right down into the brood chamber where the queen is, and right into her parlor, and take those brood frames out and examine them to see if there's any sign of AFB. She doesn't like that. So we are putting additional stress onto the swarms, And that stress in itself also then manifests as another symptom of ill health for the bees. So we look now at what is happening in terms of trying to contain this. And there are a number of things being done, from actually burning the entire swarm, if you find it has a bee, actually obliterating it. That is legislation in some countries. You actually completely wipe out the swarm. Other countries will allow antibiotics to be used. Can you believe that? Antibiotics, and that gets into the honey, gets into the population. So you find America, meat and poultry is riddled with antibiotics and with hormones. The problem is that is not actually happening ahead of the problem. It's just pouring cold water on the fire, as it were. Here it's illegal, and so hopefully the beekeepers here will adhere to the legislation. The interesting thing that we spoke about at the meeting on Saturday was what I call the course resolution of the symptoms. I gave a little talk on what I regard as the lower resolution. The little cell where the AFB occurs comes about because the queen lays the egg in the cell. The cell is filled with some worker jelly, and because there's some AFB spores on the hairs of the nurse bee, there'll be X number of spores introduced into that worker jelly, and the larva then hatches and starts to consume that jelly. And at a certain point, the nurse bees will cap the cell. While that larva is growing bigger and bigger, it is excreting. And it's the excretia from the larva that triggers the spore into a bacteria. The spore can lie dormant for 40 or 50 years, no problem. The bacteria then attacks the little larva and consumes whatever royal jelly is left over, and at the point where all the food or the nutrient in that cell is at its absolute end, the bacteria suddenly switch state and they produce upwards of 2 billion spores in one cell. Now, can you imagine how minute that little spore is, that 2 billion of them can fit inside a little cell which is only about 4 millimeters across and maybe 15 or 16 millimeters deep. Then what happens is this little larva dies, and the nurse bees realize something's wrong, and they then open the little capping to see what's gone wrong, and hey presto, you released 2 billion spores from one cell into the hive. They dutifully go and clean it all out, try and remove the little dead piece of larva that's left over, making it ready for the queen to come in and lay the next egg and start the whole process again. So what happens is the hive dies out because there are there's a reduction in the number of little babies coming up and becoming adults. Eventually the hive will die, and that's the end of that hive. In the dying process, of course, other bees will come along and rob that hive, because they are very opportunistic. They will go for a hive, and if there aren't sufficient retaliation, bees coming out, they'll go right in and they'll rob that hive. And of course they go in there, and it's all covered with that. And I gave a parallel to when I started work in the mines. I worked in basically a beehive, pitch dark, all little tunnels, and there were like 4,000 or 5,000 of us working on a shift. Right, we had our headlamps. And part of my course was to work with the ventilation department. And we had to balance the airflow between the different levels so that all the miners received about the same amount of air to keep it clean. And some of the tunnels were deeper down, were so far down that we had to really do a lot of closing off of the top tunnels to force the air down to be sucked out by the great big extraction fan. So slow was the air that we actually couldn't measure it with an anemometer, which is a little gadget with a fan on it, and the airflow strong enough to cause the little fan to turn, and it will measure X number of rotations. That becomes you can calculate the volume. But there wasn't enough even to turn that, so we had to use silver paint, the powder from silver paint, in the dark, and puff it and hold it a tape out and measure it traveling in the drift across that tape, and then stop it with a stopwatch. Now that particle of silver paint is many times greater than a spore of AFB. So now if we come back to the beehive, what happens is that they build tunnels of air through the hive, and they will fan to keep the temperature either higher or lower, where they'll bring water in, carry water in, and they will evaporate the water to keep the temperature of the hive around about 37 degrees. But because they're bringing in nectar, which has got about 80 or 90% water in it, they have to evaporate that water or that nectar down to 15, 16, 17% to create honey. So there's a whole army of bees down there that are simply waving they're flapping their wings inside the hive to create a draft through the hive. And my hypothesis was, or my feeling was, that these spores are so minute that those bees were actually then fanning these spores through the hive and actually getting out of the hive. And therefore, it would end up in a downwind situation where those spores would be blown downwind. Now, going back to the deploughing situation, at the time we were deploughing, I think it was, at that time, downy mildew arrived. It came in on a couple of stockies, as they call them, little vine shoots that came in from France, and that was planted. They didn't somehow do a proper phyto testing on the plants, and the next thing, downy mildew appeared. At that point, the farmers were weekly farmers. They farmed from Monday till Friday. Saturday and Sunday, everybody sat back and had a break. With the arrival of downy mildew, the whole farming industry changed. No more was it a 5-day-a-week farming. It was now a 7-day-a-week farming. We know with cattle and chickens and stuff, you farm 7 days a week, but as a fruit farmer or a vineyard farmer, you don't. You're only farming from Monday to Friday. If the macro weather conditions over your farm were right on Friday night, you better be out there on Saturday morning early spraying, otherwise you would lose your vineyard. And I remember one farmer I was applying to, standing and said to me, "See, Mr. Godwin, have a look at that." That farmer did not go and spray on Saturday morning. And there, look, there's where the downy mildew started, and it went up, like I talked about that pH, it went up like that, and it literally swept over and consumed his vineyards. But not only it went over and hit the other farmers downwind. I think it took about 3 years for that downy mildew to move from here to all the vineyards up in Uppington on the Orange River. Now you think, either they went up there because of stockies taken up there, or they're blown up with the wind, who knows. But the downy mildew is now all over, and it's caught in the oak trees and everywhere. So nature moves things around unbelievably efficiently. So while we are concentrating on what I call the coarser resolution of bits and pieces, we need to look at the finer resolutions. And I think that's where we've lost the plot. We don't actually sit down and have a scientific body that looks down, way down at the low resolution. So come back to the Arctic issue that you mentioned. There must be some lower resolution issue way back that triggered, and then it built like a tsunami, the old chaos theory. The butterfly wing caused another stronger one, another stronger, and eventually you had an effect down in the Arctic. So we need to be able to somehow model and go backwards and backwards and backwards and try and find patient zero. What happened there? And then we say, okay, that's what happened there. Now we can start to take some palliative action at that point, and then let the chaos theory work on our basis going forward. Do we have the time to do that? Well, I don't know the answer to that. It looks pretty dismal, all things being equal. So yes, there will have to be some drastic taken. I mean, America's just decided that they're going to reduce dramatically some of their emissions. And it's already been told that it's too late, too little too late, or too much too late. It depends how you look at it. But certainly there have to be major interventions started very, very quickly. Energy, how are we producing energy? How much water are we using to just consume in energy? I mean, the world's demand for energy is absolutely unbelievable. And yet, Africa, there are large areas of Africa where people are living with hardly any energy to worry about. So it's just that our modernization, our modern technology demands this incredible amount of energy, and these things all consume resources. They consume resources at a phenomenal rate. So we need somewhere in the world. If I had the chance to do it and had enough sufficient, I'd like to start a scientific operation that would start to look at the low resolution aspects and say, well, this is what happened there, and if we can change that, we can start the whole thing to run parallel with the major interventions that are being planned or spoken about at the various, there's these the COP1 and COP3 and COP5, whatever the number is to now, I'm not sure. Hope that answers your question.
Yes.